My guest on this edition of ADE Spotlight Podcast is Michigan Representative Joseph Bellino, who represents the 17th District in the state of Michigan. I was interested in having Mr. Bellino come on and talk to us about the legislative efforts that are being made to address the opioid epidemic. I've had the opportunity to have a lot of conversations with people about opioids from many different disciplines, be it law enforcement or professional counselors, and I thought that it would be interesting to focus today on what's being done legislatively. So I've asked Mr. Bellino to come on. He is the sponsor of a bill, Michigan House Bill 4408, which we will talk about in this conversation. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and as always, we welcome your feedback. Mr. Bellino, thank you for joining us here for this edition of ADE's Spotlight Podcast. I'm happy to have you here, and I'm hoping today that we can talk about the legislative approach to what folks are calling the opioid epidemic now. I've been fortunate to have conversations with a lot of people about this issue, and we're looking at it from a lot of different angles, and I think it'll be helpful to have you here with us today. Before we start, perhaps you could just inform the listeners a little bit about yourself, your involvement with the state of Michigan legislature, and your specific involvement with this issue.
Thank you. I was voted into office last November, so I've been in office about 10 months now. And I was very fortunate early on to have the governor come up to me and ask me to be on the opioid task force that there was an opening in. There's a task force with Republican and Democratic senator, Republican, Democratic House member, and the House member is Andy Scholl, Republican on my side, was termed out, so they gave me that spot. And the senators are Senator Analik and Senator Shootmaker. And so we get together every couple months and talk about legislation of what's going on, progress forward to help people. So I was lucky to be put on that. I never thought I'd be in politics. 59 years old. One day I woke up and said, you know what? There needs to be some different ideas up there, some change. I was a small business owner and still am. I was on a college I was a college trustee, 15 years at Monroe County Community College, and I decided not to do that again and ran for office and caught some lightning and won. I bring a little bit of different experience to the House. As a recovering addict, and I went to rehab in '83. I have some ideas and some experiences that a lot of people in the House and Senate don't have. So I'm hoping, as up to now and forward, I can bring some of my experiences and share my experiences and get some legislation passed and make it better for the people. Now, I, for one, know we can't legislate sobriety. I know that for a fact. But there are a few things we can do to make it harder for addicts to get this stuff and make it easier for doctors and prescribers to see who's trying to get it all over the country and all over the state. So that's where my ideas are now, and that's where I am today.
I want to talk about some of the specific legislative efforts here in Michigan. But before we do that, let me ask you this. You mentioned the Michigan Opioid Task Force. How long has that been in effect?
I think three and a half years. Yep. I was a new man on it, and the first time we got together, there was some controversy on whether the bills being pushed out with all their names on it would have my name on it because I was brand new. But when they heard me talk and found out my experience with drugs and alcohol and sobriety and staying sober and working on staying sober and helping other people, then I was gladly taken aboard by people from both sides of the party and given some credit towards things they're working on. So I think about three and a half years, yep. I think the governor actually might have two different task force, one that works tightly with him and one that works on the outside working on stuff. I know Senator Zorn's on a task force, not the same one I'm on, and there's a couple of senators and House people on that too. So, and we call this an opioid epidemic, but I'm not really sure that we have more addicts on the street than we did 10, 15, 20 years ago. But this is a drug that's killing people left and right. And so people have jumped aboard and tried to help people out quicker than usual. I mean, back in the 70s, we were smoking lots of marijuana, doing lots of drinking. In fact, as a high schooler, I protested the fact that I could not drink at 18, but my friends could go to Vietnam and die. So we pressed the legislature. They changed the law for 2.5, 3 years because they found out more of us were dying from alcohol driving around been dying in Vietnam and other wars and other areas, and they changed the law back right away. So you can see how the tide turns on these things, even going back to the 70s. And now we're on an opioid, we have an opioid epidemic. We have too many people dying left and right of all walks of life, poor, rich, middle class, upper class, any color, any sex, and it's sad. So we're trying to work hard on it to keep the drug out of people's hands. So.
You mentioned for those folks listening to this that aren't in the state of Michigan, you mentioned that brief little window when the drinking age went down to 18 here in the state of Michigan, and shortly thereafter went back up to 21, and I'm right around that age range as well, and so I often run into people who fell into that little window, and it sounds like you're one of them as well.
But I've been told that I was supposed to quit drinking for a half a year. They changed the law back to 21, but I don't remember quit drinking at all. So.
Oh, imagine that! Yeah, I can't imagine many others did it either. So, but getting back to this rather serious issue of the opiates, I became aware earlier this year of something called the Michigan Automated Prescription System. Are you familiar with that, Joe?
Yeah, MAPS. Yeah.
Yeah, and I in talking to people about that, it looked to me, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was sort of an effort to regulate the prescriptions of opiates and to track people who may be abusing prescriptions. Is that a correct assumption?
Correct, and this is our second time with this system. The first MAPS was real clunky. It took a lot of time. This one is quick. They tell me 10, 15 seconds. You can put the person's ID stuff in the computer and find out if they've been to Walgreens around the corner or CVS or other doctors in the area or other states. Because when it's all said and done, I think we're going to have 47, 48 states hooked up to this system, which would be great for tracking the drug. But the problem we're going to have, and the problem we're having now, is that, we're not, quote unquote, paying the doctors to look this up. And Lord forbid we ask the doctors to do something that they don't get paid for. So right now we're having a pushback, or we're asking them to do something that is beyond their realm of scope of what they've been doing for 35, 20, or 40 years, whatever. Because we all know that the doctors know better than us. They're trained and know better than us. But how dare we ask them to use this computer to see if this person, Joe Bellino, has been abusing opioids. So that's the pushback we're getting now. So hopefully, with upcoming legislation, we make it mandatory to use it. And they're not going to like it, but you got to be honest. The doctors and providers have a hand in this problem, whether they like to say so or not. And I think a lot of the younger ones, the more progressive, are finally saying, yes, we are part of the problem. They are definitely part of the problem because they didn't realize what they were doing early on in this epidemic. I know they were told by Purdue Pharmaceutical and other companies that if a person is not an addict now and you prescribe it, they won't become an addict. Well, the problem is when you get 30 or 40 pills for, say, a hernia, and you've got 10 days worth 3 times a day, it's hard not to be an addict when you're taking pills for 10 days, 3 times a day at that potency. So that's the problem with the MAP system. It's an excellent system. It's quick. If you get on it, you can see what the gentleman or lady or person's been doing and buying these prescriptions. And let's be honest, most people use these drugs the correct way. The problem is they're getting too many or maybe too many times, and then that's where the problem lies. It was pretty common for a doctor a couple years ago to give them 100 opioids for outpatient surgery. Well, those opioids sit in the cabinet for time, and next thing you know, they're gone. Somebody else has got them, and they're using them to get high instead of correct the pain. So there lies the problem. So it's an excellent system. It works quick now, but it's got to be used to be effective. So unless you use it, you're not gonna find out.
So this MAP system, this Michigan Automated Prescription System, is a database wherein the doctor then would put in information about the patient and what it is that they prescribed for the patient?
Correct. And they'll know if they've been getting opioids, because a lot of people doctor shop. A lot of addicts like myself doctor shop, or they call dentists. They don't know because they have pain in the tooth, so they try to get these prescriptions. But if you're on the system and it's in the system that Joe Bellino bought an opioid at Walgreens, the next day CVS can see that Joe Bellino bought the same prescription at Walgreens, and they'll stop it.
So, although it says Michigan automated prescription system, you're saying that there's reciprocity in other states. So,
yes, right. As I heard last month, I think there's 47 states have it or are working on finishing up the system, so we'll all be linked in. And I think the federal government wants all 50 states to be on it too, so that'll probably happen soon.
And so,
it makes too much sense because we have this. We're on 75 here in Monroe, Michigan, and we're on this corridor between Florida and Michigan. And then when you look at the opioid epidemic, there's a lot of activity in Ohio and Tennessee, Kentucky coming up north and going down south. So they're using doctors, getting lots of pills and taking them north and south and selling them. We had a real bad doctor in Monroe for a long time. I don't want to say his name, but he was a real bad doctor. And if you came in and had a pain and you paid cash, he gave you a prescription. He took an MRI or X-ray and he gave you a prescription. Well, I have a small market right near his office. And one day a man came into my store and he had tears in his eyes. He said, "I dropped my prescription." Well, I'm thinking, blood pressure, it's heart, he needs it, the wind's blowing. I said, "I'll help you. I know where all the paper blows in my lot, in my property when the wind blows this way." So I went back to the back of the property. I found 2 prescriptions out of 3. He had 3 of them. Before I handed them back to the man, I looked at them. They were for 100 opioids. So that man had 3 prescriptions for 300 pills that he was going to go back to Ohio, he's from Toledo, and sell them. And there hence lies the growth of the problem back then. So hopefully today we're getting rid of these bad doctors and we're cracking down on these huge prescriptions and we're giving smaller prescriptions, and that will help ease the want and the addiction craving. If you can't get it, I mean, you got to start making other changes. As an addict, you don't change until you feel pain. And maybe if a person can't get them all the time, quickly, maybe they'll start changing their behavior, and maybe pain will happen that they'll get sober. So
this database would be available to doctors as well as to pharmacists who would then be filling these prescriptions, and we'd be able to track the history of an individual as they go through the system. What are the? I would imagine there may be some pushback relative to privacy in this. Have you run across that?
Not really. The only pushback we're getting is from the medical profession, but I think they're easing up. There's been some language changes, but the pushback right now is from the medical profession itself, not from the pharmacists, because there are bills out there to help the pharmacists too, but it's the medical profession, the doctors themselves. So.
You mentioned pharmacists. One of the interesting things here as I was looking through my notes related to the maps was there is some pending legislation, maybe it's not pending anymore, that does protect pharmacists from civil liability if a pharmacist refuses to fill a prescription.
Correct. And before this bill was passed through the House, and I think the governor, I don't know if the governor signed it yet, but it went through the House, pharmacists could have got sued for not filling a prescription. Well, if a pharmacist's been there 10, 15, 20 years, they have an idea who the addicts are when they're coming in. If they feel it's just the opioids are just to fuel their addiction, not for a real medical cause, they didn't have the ability to say, "No, I'm not filling it," without getting sued, which doesn't make any sense to me, because the pharmacists know better than the doctors sometimes who the addicts are, because they're seeing the people all the time. So it's great legislation to protect the pharmacist. And some of my pharmacist friends say sometimes it got violent and real verbal when they refused a prescription. So, and I understand that completely. If you're jonesing and you need the drug bad, you're not going to say, "Well, thank you very much," and walk out. So,
the listeners of these podcasts know that my father was a pharmacist for many years, but he also, after he sold his drugstores, he worked for the Department of Licensing and Regulation here in the state of Michigan. Unfortunately, he's passed away. I think I would love to have this conversation with him, his view on some of these changes as well. But it's an interesting idea. And the other thing related to that I made a note here of, Joe, was limiting prescriptions to a 30-day supply for chronic pain sufferers and a 7-day supply for acute pain sufferers. Now, that idea has been bandied about, and I've talked to people from a wide range of disciplines about that idea. And there has been some comments made to me that limiting that supply while on the one hand it may prevent the abuse, you mentioned the gentleman with the getting 100 pills at a time and that sort of thing. So limiting the supply may prevent some abuse. I have had some folks say to me that limiting that supply leads people to go back out on the streets and look for those drugs in illegal or unsafe manners. So I kind of get some feedback from both sides of that, and just wondered if you could clarify maybe the position of the legislature on that issue.
Well, that hasn't been written in stone yet, and I see both sides of it. I've talked to people who have chronic pain and don't want to go back every month, or people with acute pain. I talked to her this weekend, and the insurance companies now stepping forward, and they're stepping in front of the legislation. And she said her Blue Cross was going to make her come back every 7 days. This lady Saturday I talked to, every 7 days to refill her prescription. And that would be a pain for her to go back to the pharmacist every 7 days for a prescription. But that's something she said Blue Cross was instituting. And so it's possible that they see what's happening with the legislation coming through the House and Senate, and they're jumping forward. And it's possible they see that they could probably help with the problem. But if you have acute pain, and the only pain relief you have is an opioid, well, that could be a terrible thing to be in. But here's my follow-up to that, though. Before we started using these opioids for chronic pain, now let's get honest here. When opioids first came out in the 70s, early 80s, or whatever it was, we used them only for cancer patients to keep them comfortable while they died. And somewhere along the line, it got to the point where whatever pain you had, whether you bump your head or you have chronic pain that we can't figure out, now you take an opioid. So somewhere along the line, we switched the use for it, and hence more and more pills on the street, more and more pills everywhere else, because people change the definition of what it's used for. So I'm not sure when it happened or why it happened. I'm sure the pharmaceutical companies have a hand in that, because they're obviously not losing money on opioids. But I remember doctors telling me that they only used them for people dying of cancer in the early days. That's all they used them for, and now they're used for everything. So that is concerning to me, that we've taken this drug that was used for one thing, make you comfortable while you're dying, and now it's for every pain you might have. So obviously that we can't use Motrin 800s anymore for pain because they don't work anymore for some people. But they worked in the old days. Something worked in the old days, and what worked back then? Why can't it work now? That's my question.
I seem to recall that recently there was a large sort of national chain pharmacy that is self-limiting those prescriptions to a 7-day supply. I may be wrong on that, but I recall reading that recently. One of the other interesting notes here that I found when I was looking at the pending legislation was the idea that it would require prescribers to have a bona fide physician-patient relationship. Now, when I read that, my assumption is that that's an attempt to prevent doctor shopping. That if there's no bona fide or verifiable relationship, then the prescriber won't be able to prescribe these opiate drugs. Is my reading on that correct?
Correct. That's all about doctor shopping. Yep.
Interesting. I want to get into a specific bill that you've sponsored, but before I do that, let's step outside the state of Michigan. We've talked about some of these approaches here in the state of Michigan. In your research, have you found similar approaches either from the federal government or from other states when you looked at some of this legislation?
Well, this other states are similar to us. They may be a little ahead of the curve of us, or maybe behind the curve, but they're doing the same types of things that they can do to keep the pills out of people's hands. But when it comes to the federal government, they're a little slower. I mentioned earlier, pharmaceutical companies said if you were an addict and you took this drug, you wouldn't become an addict. Well, we found out that was a lie. And then we got the federal government that has these scoring surveys when you leave the hospital. And the fifth one is how do they manage your pain? And you can lose Medicaid, Medicare money if you get bad scores. So they want you not to be in pain. So let's get honest. The federal government's part of this too. That fifth question, how do they manage your pain? If they can give you something to kill the pain, then you got a bad mark, and it's bad for the hospital. So the feds are looking at this, and they want to change this, but they move a lot slower than state government. And I know they got to get that fifth question off of that sheet and get the pain out of it, or change the way the question's worded. Because right now you're making money, you're getting better scores by giving opioids. and that's not what it was supposed to be about. So they're a lot farther behind us. But other states are doing similar stuff with us. The doctor shopping, the MAP system, the minors, the prescriptions to minors are very similar to most other states, what they're doing right now. Our governor put a task force together early on, because some states are just doing it now, so we're a little bit ahead of the curve of some states. So that's where we're at with that.
That's very interesting. So you're saying that when a patient leaves a hospital, they are asked to take a survey.
Yep.
Well, one of the survey questions has to do with how satisfied they were with how their pain was managed. A low score, or the scores in general, are tied to federal funding?
Correct. Yep.
Wow.
And it's a shame. It's a shame. And so when I read a couple years, 3 or 4 years ago, that my hospital got a bad score, they don't tell us where they scored bad. It could have been that fifth question. What if they were ahead of the game and said, we're not giving you opioids, we're giving you Motrin 800, so you're left with a little bit of pain, or you're left without a big smile on your face? Because so that my hospital got a bad marking for that, and other hospitals got good markings, and that's all tied to federal money. And that's the shame part of it. Now, I think they had good things in mind when they came up with this score sheet with federal money. Make sure you're taking care of the patient. They're getting good care. They're all getting good care, all even care. You're taking care of everybody you can. I understand that, but the fifth question about the pain turned into a huge problem.
Yeah, the law of unintended consequences. I see that.
Correct. Yep.
Well, let's get to a bill that you've sponsored. This is here in Michigan, House Bill 4408. Why don't you tell me a little bit about how that developed and where that stands with the legislature?
Well, 4408 was a bill originally to make sure that doctors had parents or guardians okay to give a prescription for opioids or to give opioids to a minor. What we found out was that a lot of kids had football injuries, basketball injuries, and they were getting prescriptions, and their parents didn't know about it. And in fact, one of our house members lost a nephew after started taking opioids after a football injury. So my legislation will make sure that the parent, pardon me, the parent or guardian know for a fact or sign a waiver saying, yes, you can give my son Johnny or Joey Bellino, you can give him an opioid for his pain. That's where mine is now. It's changing right now as it goes to the Senate. Some of the words are changing, and I've been assured from Senator Shirkey that the whole gist of it won't change, but they're changing some words of it right now in the Senate.
What surprises me, I suppose, from an outsider's perspective, is that this wasn't already required. I guess that's a bit of a surprise to me that a doctor could prescribe something to a minor without parental authorization.
That surprised me too, but you know what? When you talk to the doctor side of it, they can't believe that we're trying to interfere with their practice. That's the general gist for most doctors. And we have 2 doctors in the Republican caucus in the House. And that's their feeling on this. How dare you tell us when or what to prescribe to who? And I understand that because the doctor has the knowledge, but I don't believe the doctors came down here on the earth as Jesus Christ, so I've got some problems with it.
I understand. Yeah, I understand, I suppose, and on a certain level, that objection. But it seems to me that there's a parental authorization should be required not only for this, but most medical care outside, of course. There are exceptions, of course. There are exceptions for medical emergencies, I understand, and there's exceptions for an individual who may be in hospice care and that sort of thing, sort of common sense objections. But what other than from the medical community, has there been critics of this bill?
Not really, no. It's people think it's pretty much common sense, which sometimes we lack in Lansing. So
this would then become part of an electronic medical record for this minor, this parental authorization?
I think it would be, yeah. You would see on maps how old the person is and how if he got the okay from his parents or guardian. It just makes too much sense to me because I know as a recovering addict, and I've met and I've seen young people die, relatives, people that work for me. You get on an opioid and you're on it for a few days, and all of a sudden the pills dry up, well, what are you going to do next? You're going to go find the heroin. It's only $10. It's cheaper than the pill. It gives you the same buzz, and hence people are dying because the mix of the heroin's not what it used to be. There's too much fentanyl in it, and so they're not getting the pills. So I know when kids get on these pills for a few days, it can be hell to get off it and to get away from it and get some kind of a life back together after you've been on them. As an addict, I've seen it, I've experienced it, and I know it to be true.
Great point. I think that's a great point. So I guess my follow-up question to that is, in addition to some of these efforts to track individuals' use and potential abuse through the MAP system, to encourage and maybe eventually mandate prescribers to use the MAP system, to control some of the time frames and the size of the prescriptions or the length of time for these prescriptions, to prevent some of the doctor shopping, to have parental authorization for minors' use of opiates. Are there efforts made within this legislation or this bundle of legislation for recovery efforts as well once somebody becomes addicted? Is there some effort to provide funding or encouragement for recovery?
Yes, I think it was Andy Shore's bill is asking the state for more money for rehab, and as I tell people jokingly, the addiction to opioids or heroin is not my father's alcoholism. And I say that jokingly because it's my alcoholism, it's my drug addiction. It's totally different today than it was for me in the early 80s. I'm happy to say that I'm lucky to have just been a cocaine addict and an addict to alcohol, gin per se. Also, I'm lucky to have that because today's heroin or opioid addict is totally different. It's a more mental addiction. It takes a longer time to get sober, I believe, and I believe a lot of that's got to do with where you're living and your surroundings. So I went to 28 days of rehab. I started going to AA meetings. I came back to a decent family. I got married to a wonderful woman, and I had good things around me. I had positive vibes around me, and I'm trying to get sober. I'm trying to change my life. Well, you go to 28 days of rehab and get out and go back to the same setting you were in when you were using heroin or opioids, and if it's not a good setting, you have a tough time keeping it together. So we need to have money for funding for long-term rehab. I'm talking 6 months, 12 months, a year and a half to a setting like a Dawn Farms or something like that. Or in Monroe, we have a place called Paula's House. And people get their lives back together and develop the things around them they need to live a sober life, like sober friends, like a job, a good job, a meaning for living. And that's what we need for this addiction. And it wasn't happening before. So hopefully we do some stuff to fund some people to be in long-term rehab somehow. Because it's 28 days, a spin dry is just not working for this addict.
This is part of the approach for the opioid task force?
Yes, and that's Andy Shore's bill, yep. And I'm so happy that Andy sponsored that. He's a great guy to have on the floor with me. He's a wonderful Democrat. All he wants to do is help people, and I think that is the best of all our bills in this package. Is his bill right there to get more funding for rehab.
For those of us that aren't really fully immersed in the legislative process, what happens now with these ideas that we've discussed and these bills as they move from the House to the Senate or vice versa? When would we expect to see some action on these?
So a lot of the bills are in the House right now, and there's some voting in health policy. I think tomorrow or Wednesday. And it comes out of health policy, then goes to the floor, comes off the floor, goes to the Senate. Some bills have done that already and are in the Senate, ready to come back to the House for little changes. They're pretty transparent going back and forth. And when they're all done with going from the Senate to the House and all the language is correct, then it goes to the governor, where I'm pretty sure the governor's going to sign everything. So I think they'll all be signed by the end of session in December. I think that's the timeline on it.
And they would be these would become effective immediately? Is there some grace period for these?
Yeah, there's a few days grace period, but we'll go for immediate effect, and that'll be within 30 days. I'll go with the law. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was talking to somebody not so long ago about a program called Hope Not Handcuffs. I don't know if you're familiar with that program here in Michigan, but it's really more of a law enforcement effort to encourage people who are struggling with opiates or heroin they can come forward and ask for help without risk of any criminal charges. I appreciate seeing those kinds of efforts, and I know that our professional counseling partners are stepping up their level of education and intervention as it regards opioids, and I'm encouraged to see that there's legislative efforts like these as well. This is to borrow a phrase, this is an epidemic. We've seen things like this before. You and I spoke before about going back into the 1980s when there was we could call it a crack epidemic, and those of us working in the field at that time were working hard to provide specific treatment for people who are using crack. And I can remember 4 or 5 years ago seeing front page newspaper articles about the need for increased funding for methamphetamine. And so here we are now in 2017, and we're talking about opioids. And in some respects, there's nothing new under the sun. But as you mentioned a few minutes ago, there is something different about this. There is something different about people who are using opioids, then going out and buying heroin off the street with all of the inherent dangers of that. It's encouraging to see all these efforts, and I really want to appreciate and thank you for coming out and talking about the efforts that you're making and educating us just a little bit about what it is the state of Michigan's doing on a legislative level to address this. I want to thank you for your time and good luck with these efforts.
Well, thank you. And I'm encouraged because, for the first time, we've got the government and the professional people and the court system all working together to try to keep people out of prison, out of jail, and to get them better in life and to get them sober and have them leading a productive life. Because it seems to me like the more we do that, the more we'll save money in the long run. And we'll help lives and save lives too. So that's what I'm encouraged about. So thank you.
Before I let you go, one thing of interest to me, I don't know, something like this MAPS system, for example, 10 or 15 years ago probably couldn't have existed. I don't know that the technology would have existed to allow these extensive databases to track people. So that's interesting to me. That's part of what we at ADE, part of what we do here is provide these client management databases, and we do things that technology allows us to do we couldn't do years ago. So I think that's a positive development as well.
Yep, it is. And it's the map system is just an IT development. It's kind of like robots in factories, and it makes our job easier to get things done. And what you're doing helps out the court system and identifies other things need to be done, and it makes it all easier for us and to help people. It makes it easier to give the services to help people, which is wonderful.
Mr. Bellino, how can people get in touch with you if they want to discuss this with you or any of these issues that we've covered, or maybe issues that we didn't cover? How can they get a hold of you?
Well, they can get a hold of me at my office in Lansing, and I'll give you that number right now, 517-373-1530, or they can email me at josephbellino@house.mi.gov. So look me up. I'm in the house, and give me a call or send me an email, and I'll be happy to talk. And I'm also on Facebook as Joe Bellino, so it's you can do that too.
Thanks, Joe.
All right, thank you very much, sir.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the ADE Spotlight Podcast. If you would like to be a guest on one of our podcasts, or if you have an idea for a topic you'd like us to cover, please feel free to drop us a line. We'd love to hear your suggestions. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to check out ADE Solutions, a new website from ADE. There you will find a variety of quizzes and assessments covering a whole range of behavioral health related topics, including substance use, gambling, mental health disorders, eating disorders, and the like. If you have concerns about yourself or a loved one in these areas, please access the website and check out the assessments. Or if you simply want to expand your knowledge on these topics, on the education tab on that website, we have a variety of quizzes as well as other podcasts similar to the one that you just listened to. You can find that at www.ade.solutions, or you can link to it from our corporate website, www.adeincorp.com.